as said, I'm going to give you a bit of an overview, a starting point for stimulants, and I think you're going to go more into depth and detail on the Norwegian situation, but I'm planning to give you a little bit of the European background and picture, and try and get you a little bit focused on the subject before the detail. So, stimulants. Just to begin to think, what are we talking about here? Okay, so we've got a group of substances that have a long history of both licit, legitimate and illicit use. They're substances that can be found in medicines, in cold remedies. You've probably heard of the fad for diet pills. They're used in medicines, for example, ADHD. They were used in the war and continue to be used in wars, Captagon, to keep soldiers awake. They're a common group of prescription medicines. They are used for performance enhancement, for sport, to keep people awake, to study aids, and they're used recreationally. That's the subject I'm mainly going to focus on. They're valued as a group of substance in terms of the effect they give. They keep you awake, they give you energy, can give you a high. So they're uppers. They're a group of uppers. The substances we're talking about include our favourite stimulant, caffeine, coffee, as well as the medicines like Ritalin, cocaine, amphetamines, new psychoactive substances. Some of those are stimulants, so some of the new drugs, and mephedrone or cathinones is one of the ones you may have heard of, and of course MDMA or ecstasy. These are the substances that I'm going to talk about because I primarily work with illicit drugs, okay? So cocaine, amphetamine, methamphetamine, MDMA, and a little bit on synthetic cathinones, which are the new drugs on the block, new kids. So, stimulants. I mean, when we think about drugs, we think of illicit. We tend to think cannabis, then this group of stimulants, and then we often think of the opiates like heroin. So this group of stimulants, they do have a special place in our sort of illicit drug-taking repertoire. They're, as mentioned by the previous speaker, they are the drugs most clearly linked to nightlife and parties and dancing, staying awake. But they're a little bit unusual because we do have sort of rather clear two sets of users. We have a group that tend to use occasionally, maybe the odd weekend, cocaine a little bit, or amphetamine, and what we call more recreational use. But we do have, for this group of drugs, people that inject or smoke crack cocaine. So we have a problem user group. So these substances are unlike heroin, where they're almost always a problem use. This group can go, if you like, in two directions, and people may use relatively unproblematically, a little bit at the weekend, okay, or quite heavily over a long period of time, large amounts, and have problems. So they take cocaine, for example, both a luxury, still a little bit of a high life reputation, but then you've got the crack cocaine, and it's very much the opposite. It's around problems. So they go, they kind of spread across our drug-using scenes. As a group, there's also a set of harms that we see with stimulants, particularly linked to injection, frequent injection, also linked to sexual risks. As a group of drugs, we have dependence, and there's a set of mental health problems. But I think further speakers will talk more about those aspects. So, I'm going to focus on the latest trend and development for this group of drugs in Europe. We've done 3 studies in recent years looking at 3 of these substances. I'm just going to touch on a couple of points from these studies. I'll have to point over there. I was pointing here. Okay. So stimulants and use. These are the big numbers. We have an annual report called the European Drug Report, which has some sort of overall in Europe, this is how it is. So here we have cocaine, MDMA, and amphetamines. When we're talking about use, we look at surveys, and we tend to focus on the younger age group, who are more likely to use, and we look at last year use, not lifetime. That gives us a bit of better idea what's going on. So what we have is 2.4 million young people have used cocaine in Europe in the last year, and that's the most commonly used stimulant in Europe. 2.1 million have used MDMA, 1.3 amphetamines. So those are, if you like, the big numbers. So cocaine, in Europe, cocaine is still the most common stimulant. But it's not the most common stimulant in every country. So these are a group of drugs that show quite distinct national patterns. These maps, the darker the colour, the more common the drug is. And what we see is for cocaine, for example, it's more common in countries in the south and the west of Europe, which is actually where the drug comes in. It's, if you like, imported. So Spain, UK have got high cocaine prevalence, relatively speaking. MDMA is in the middle. Amphetamines, you see in the north, very much it's a northern European phenomena. It's more common in the north. If we look at trends, for all of these three substances, in recent surveys, there's actually been a sort of small increase in the number of surveys that have shown increases across Europe. So all three stimulants, as I call them all stimulants here, seem to, in the last surveys, show more increases, countries increasing than decreasing. Wastewater, and I think wastewater analysis is quite common, and you will know about it in Norway because you're kind of a bit in the lead in this area. But that also confirms the geographical variation in terms of where these substances are primarily used. So here's the cocaine again. You see high in London. MDMA, unsurprisingly, is high in around Amsterdam, the Netherlands, where it's produced. Amphetamines, you can see Oslo's quite high on the amphetamines, and also Belgium, Netherlands, where it's produced. This is the treatment data. So this shows people that are entering treatment for stimulants in Europe, and this is an indicator of problems and problem use. And what we see here is trends for first-time entrants. Cocaine has been fairly stable. This is the first one, over a period of time. Amphetamines, people entering treatment for, that's amphetamine and methamphetamine, it's actually lower numbers than cocaine, but it's rising. So that's a trend. MDMA, hardly anybody enters treatment in Europe for MDMA problems. It's very, very low numbers, so it's not worth showing on a graph. It's less than 1%. I think it was around 800 people in our last data entered treatment for MDMA-related problems. So that's the amphetamines, just to show the scale. The thing that we have noticed with the amphetamines is while the big trend across Europe is for injection to decrease, there's less injecting now than before, particularly heroin injecting. Amphetamines very slightly breaks the trend. So there's just a small increase in numbers entering treatment who inject amphetamines. This is another data set that again shows the geographical differences. This is seizure data, that's Beschlag. Okay, so Beschlag of stimulants. And the cocaine again, this is where the number of seizures, number of Beschlag, are greatest. And you see cocaine, they have more seizures in the south and west. Amphetamines are the red. Okay, so Norway, of all the stimulants, has more amphetamine seizures. Quite interesting is the blue, that's methamphetamine. So these are countries where of all stimulants, they have more methamphetamine seizures. And these are the trends. These are the trends in the amount of stimulants seized for the different drugs. So quite stable for cocaine. Cocaine has been stable in most different indicators for a long period of time. Amphetamine actually relatively stable. It's the MDMA, the ecstasy, where we've really seen a rise after a big drop. And this is the drop, again, we heard about earlier, the 90s, and you know, MDMA, XT quite popular. There were precursor changes. The drugs sold as MDMA or ecstasy had very little of the substance in. They became unpopular, and they're kicking back up. Methamphetamine, again, the amount seized is very small compared to the other drugs. And this is one of the other stories, which is around the purity of stimulants. And there's been an increase, particularly in the amphetamine and the MDMA content in tablets, that's quite marked. And we've seen this in the stimulant market generally, and also for some of the other substances like cannabis. There's been an overall increase in the quality, if you like, the purity of substances on the market. This is the other competitor on the stimulants market, which is the new psychoactive substances. We have an early warning system that identifies new substances or new chemicals that turn up. And there's two main groups that we see where the chemists are creating new substances. The first you will probably have heard of as synthetic cannabinoids, those that are seen as a bit of a replacement in some respects for cannabis. The other group, synthetic cathinones, these are the stimulants that compete a little bit with the other stimulant drugs. Here's mephedrone is probably the most famous one. And what we've seen in some markets is mephedrone has come in when other stimulants have been poor quality, when the ecstasy, MDMA and amphetamine or cocaine are low. So, we recently did a study on looking at the new trends in the problem use of the range of new psychoactive substances. I'm only going to just focus a little bit on the synthetic cathinones, not all of them. But what we saw was, while the reputation might be that stimulants are sort of club drugs and these were recreational substances, a number of injectors or problem drug users were starting to use and inject synthetic cathinones. We wanted to know how widespread this was. What we found, actually, was that in Europe, different countries have got a favourite synthetic cathinone. So in Hungary, for example, they use something called pentadrone. In Slovenia, they use something called 3-MMC. In other countries, mephedrone is very popular. So this is actually quite an interesting market in itself. And these drugs are being injected by users that otherwise might inject amphetamines or opioids. These synthetic cathinones are not a problem in all countries. We found 12 countries reported some of their problem drug users to be injecting cathinones, but there are pockets in the UK, particularly in Wales, in Scotland we heard about, and Hungary has a very big problem. So this is something that's apparent in different countries. We didn't get reports of this in Norway, but we did get, as I say, reports in 12 other countries. And there are different user groups. As I say, opioid and stimulant injectors. We've got homeless Roma communities. We've got at-risk young people, prisoners. And the other thing that we picked up on is slamming. And I don't know if you've heard about slamming. It's the injection, and it includes synthetic cathinones, usually a cocaine or methamphetamine, usually with GHB, amongst small groups of men who have sex with men. And it's a new group who are actually injecting stimulants, where most people are stopping injecting. This is a group in the context of sex parties. They're injecting stimulants, and there's lots of risks there, sexual risks and injection risks. And cathinones, the MPS, are involved sometimes in this phenomena. So there's lots of harms linked to these group of stimulants. As I said, HIV, HCV, physical soft tissue injuries, mental health problems, and what was quite incredible in a sense was that we had a group in Wales, we heard about a group of heroin injectors who moved to injecting cathinones. The symptoms were so bad that they moved back to heroin. Just a little bit on methamphetamine, and this I know has been a bit of a topic in Norway. This was another study that we did a few years ago to actually try and understand what was going on across Europe, because we heard that methamphetamine was on the increase. And what was interesting here, again, the countries had very different manifestations of methamphetamine use. And one of the things we found out that they were using methamphetamine differently. It wasn't used very much, but where it was used, there were different routes of administration. So the purple is where we heard about people smoking methamphetamine. The red is the snorting or sniffing, which is a bit like amphetamine. The blue is where injecting was occurring. And the yellow is actually where it was used orally. I know at the time, when this was 2013, in Norway, that the amphetamine and the methamphetamine markets were very mixed. And I'm aware the users sometimes didn't know which substance they were using. It was more the forensic analysis. And what we saw with this drug, with methamphetamine, is it had multiple faces. There was not one methamphetamine problem in Europe, and it wasn't like the States, where everybody was smoking the crystal meth. We were seeing really different things. Here again, we had the slamming, which I talked about with the cathinones. So small groups of men who have sex with men were using methamphetamine, and mainly in big cities. So we heard about it in Paris, in Amsterdam, in London. We've got the amphetamine mix that we talked about in Norway. We've got a long history, the longest history of methamphetamine use in Europe is in the Czech Republic, where they have something called Pervitin, which has traditionally been homemade, and that was on the increase. It was spreading out into Germany. And then we had something completely different going on in Greece. Opioid users were using homemade methamphetamine crystal called shisha. So this is what we see. So we talk about stimulants. What you may be seeing in Norway may be very different to what's going on in other countries, and methamphetamine's a good example. Okay, and to finish, MDMA and ecstasy. Last year we did a study on this to try and, as you've highlighted, work out what's going on, because we heard reports from lots of different countries that MDMA seemed to be coming back. Well, one of the things we found, again, was there wasn't just one trend, there were multiple trends. There wasn't just one MDMA product, there were a range of different products used in different countries. So we had the traditional tablets, if you like, ecstasy tablets, there were crystals, there were powders, and there were capsules which can contain powders or crystals. And there was a lot of variety, and this is the Global Drug Survey, but it just shows you that different countries have different preferred ways of preparing MDMA. So the UK, at this time, the powders and the crystals were most common. Netherlands, it's the pills. So what's most being used of MDMA in the Netherlands would be the pills. And there's a variety from country to country. The trends across Europe, when we look at the surveys, we are seeing most surveys where there's been a recent, an actual recent survey taking place, they've been going up. The top one there is the Netherlands. There's two really broad areas in terms of the market and consumption, and it gets a lot more detail, but two broad areas where we're seeing harms. There's harms, on the one hand, linked to increasing MDMA content in tablets, so stronger products, and there's harms linked to adulterated products, so people not getting what they think they're getting. So those are sort of two areas where we've put out warnings and alerts as an agency because we've heard of problems. One thing we've seen is a very big increase from the 90s, where your average tablet was 50 to 80 milligrams content of MDMA, and almost doubled, in some cases more than doubled, when we look at what the average is nowadays. So it's a bit like when we talk about cannabis, it's not the same. We're not talking about the same products that we were a generation or two ago, so you can't necessarily say, oh, I remember. Things can be very different, but you don't know. I mean, this is the thing, unless you test, the user won't actually know. And what we have had is what people call super pills, which have got extremely high content and very dangerous levels that have been picked up by some of the drug testing organisations. The other side of it is where people think they're buying MDMA or ecstasy, and it's got something else in. And the one I think that you will know quite well from here is PMMA, which, because it has takes longer for it to act, people don't think it's very strong, and they take too much, and this is one that can kill. There's a report that we've written on this, if you want more detail. It's got lots of different findings, but I won't take more of your time. But I think that the important thing here that we're picking up in Europe is that we have a new generation of MDMA ecstasy users, and they haven't been through the same health messages that everybody went through in the 90s around the safer dancing campaigns and drinking water and et cetera, et cetera. So across Europe, we're seeing a relatively naive user group who we need to think a little bit about our health promotion messages, and we need to make sure that they're targeted correctly to this group of users. And it's less associated with niche, clubbing, techno, and much more generalised trend we're seeing in countries. It's more of a sort of broader nightlife issue rather than a sort of specific niche group of users. So, just to finish, I don't know if I've got any more time. I'm sure you'll be waving at me with a... Yeah, okay. Okay, hot off the press. Yesterday, we launched some new data, wastewater data, and I just thought you might be interested to see that. Don't know how many of you don't know about wastewater monitoring, but it's where we look at literally what's coming through the, if you like, the public sewers to see which substances are being consumed, like a community drug test. So instead of an individual one, you're testing a community to see what substances are coming through the system. And it's a really interesting indicator of what's being used. Now, there's a group called SCORE that are working across, I think it's probably, I'm not sure, 12, 15 countries. They've got 50 cities that are involved, and they've all taken this community drug test at the same time, so you can actually compare levels between cities. So just this data came out yesterday. You can find it on the EMCDDA website and play with it if you like, but just to show a little bit. So this is looking at cocaine, and I'm sure you're going straight to Oslo, yeah? just to see. So it fits quite well with what I was telling you, so I'm glad the data agrees, yeah? So you see the cities more in the south and the west have got higher concentrations of cocaine metabolites they are in the water. So relatively low for Oslo. Here's amphetamine. As you see, a little bit higher there. Oslo is is one of the top cities, actually. I haven't put all 50 on. I'm just showing you because that would make the map very messy. But you get a sense. So amphetamine, it's higher. Methamphetamine, you see all the big ones. That's the Czech Republic. That's the Pervitin. And also Slovakia. So that's where a lot of methamphetamine is actually made in Europe. This is the trends in methamphetamine. The yellow line there, if you can see, is Oslo. So this is from 2011 to 2016. And as I was saying, I know that Norway, you've had an issue with methamphetamine, and what you see there right now, amphetamine is probably replacing methamphetamine again on the market. And what I do know, the people who are now having problems with methamphetamine are Finland. Finland's gone from no problem to a big problem. You've gone from a problem to actually low on methamphetamine. So it's kind of interesting. And here's the MDMA. And I guess that's sort of why we're here. Because Oslo, you've quite clearly got quite a lot of MDMA coming through your waste system. And that's the trend, and that's you. And I guess that's why it's timely that we're here. You're not top overall. London isn't here, Amsterdam's not here, okay? This is just a few of the cities, but this is the trend that you've seen, and you're in the top group. So this is my final slide, just to conclude. I hope that was interesting, but it shows that it's important to be here, and there is a reason, and there's a discussion to be had. So my point is that the stimulants market is interesting, it's interchangeable. A stimulant can go and a new one can come in. And the products actually compete. So if there's poor quality MDMA, you'll find probably there will be better quality amphetamine coming in, or an MPMS. We see that replacement happening in the stimulant market. As I say, the MPS have come in, they've infiltrated. It's a market that seems to be driven quite extensively by supply and availability. So what drugs are available seems to dictate what's being used. Stimulants, compared to most substances, are a group of drugs that we actually produce in Europe. So forgetting cocaine, both methamphetamine, amphetamine, and MDMA are actually produced largely in Europe, so they're not very far-travelled drugs. Cocaine, we've got secondary extraction labs where substances come in clothes and things like that, and we extract them. The cathinones, the other stimulants I talk about, they tend to come from China and India. There's recent purity increases across the board in the illicit stimulants. There's a range of harms, and some of them life-threatening. And I think one of the issues which I haven't gone into, but is important with stimulants, is the treatment challenges. This is an area where we don't necessarily, as with opioid substitution treatment, we don't have an agreed way of treating problem stimulant users with medicine. So we're talking about the psychosocial interventions, and I think there's some interesting issues there on how we actually treat stimulant problems. But that's all from me. Thank you very much.